Pendragon 6th Edition is a tabletop role-playing game by Chaosium. It was first penned and published by Greg Stafford, the founder of Chaosium, in 1985. And this edition is sort of hailed as the final or ultimate edition. I covered the starter set box for this game in a previous video, and in that video I went over all the basic mechanics of the game, some of which I think are absolutely brilliant and are features that make this game an all-time classic. In this video, I want to walk through the 260-page core rulebook, but just highlight the things I particularly enjoyed and thought were cool and unique about the game, as opposed to doing a page-by-page overview of the contents. For example, I'm going to be glossing over the combat mechanics and the gear and armor chapters for the most part because they weren't particularly inspiring to me personally. But that being said, there is a lot to be inspired by with this core rulebook. I do have some cons about this game that I'll share with you throughout the video, as well as some further reading if you want to get your head into Arthurian legend. Okay, so here are 24 reasons why Pendragon 6th Edition is absolutely fascinating. 1. This is a truly unique setting plus premise. In case you're not aware, Pendragon is a game that sets out to put you in the role of a knight in or around early 6th century Britain, specifically in the time of King Arthur. Now that's so far back in history and so thoroughly written about through the prism of Arthurian legend that it's hard to say if the details of this setting are very historically accurate. In fact, there are some intentional anachronisms like jousting and other things that didn't come until later in Britain's history. Due to that fact, I like to call this Arthurian fantasy. It's a certain flavor of fantasy focused not only on the setting of Arthurian's Britain through the lens of the legends, particularly the lens of 1485's The Death of Arthur by Thomas Malory, but also through the hearts and minds of melodramatic knights. In that sense, being both couched in that setting and focusing on knights who are subject to their traits and passions and ideals, Pendragon is a singular, unique role-playing game. 2. You can play as a lady knight. There is in fact historical and literary precedence for female knights, and that's a player option in this game as well. But the game's writers anticipated that GMs and players might be a little skeptical about this, so they included essentially 3 different ways to include lady knights in your game, if you choose to have them at all. They can be commonplace, which is of course not historically accurate, but could be a lot of fun and would simply sidestep gender as an issue at all. They can be trailblazers, which means they're few and far between, but growing in acceptance and recognition in your version of the setting. Or they could be rarities, almost never seen and always turning heads. A great example of this in fiction would be Brienne of Tarth. She was not exactly trailblazing the way for other women to follow, but rather a rarity who came and went. 3. There are 4 tiers of knight. So one of the big issues I had with the starter set, and really with the game generally, is the fact that there's a lot that you have to understand about the setting before you can begin to get the most out of it. And this is a great example. There are generally 4 tiers or ranks of knight that you can be. The mercenary knight is the lowest. They sort of eat what they kill. They have to pay for their room and board, their armor and equipment, and their horses. They have no liege lord to order them around, but neither do they have a liege lord who will pay for all those things. So when times are lean, they will find themselves pawning their armor just to pay for a place to sleep. Next, you have the household knight, who are young, usually unmarried knights who serve a lord and receive a half-decent yearly stipend in the form of knightly goods and services. If they do something heroic, they might receive a gift of land or money. The next step up is the vassal knight, who holds land and is responsible for a village. They do some knightly duties, but also spend a fair amount of time managing their estate, which can be a difficult task. This core rulebook actually doesn't address any mechanics or ideas for how that would work in the game, alluding to a future supplement that might explore land and village management a bit more. Finally, you have banneret knights. These are the highest ranking of the knights, and they command so-called conroys, which are like platoons of 5 to 15 mounted knights and 10 to 30 foot soldiers. They always have to go to war with their conroys, but have the obvious advantage of being high enough rank that they're frequently rubbing elbows with nobles and aristocracy, so their chances of elevating their family through deals and marriages is much higher than that of the other knights. But again, in order for all these cool details to really sing at the table, everyone has to be well read enough to know that these details are in play. I guess this is a problem with a lot of specific RPG settings where the player doesn't always know what the player character would and should absolutely know. 4. Quest versus adventure. The terms quest and adventure are interchangeable in most contexts, but in the world of Pendragon, they are very much two different things, and your player knight should know the difference. Adventures are merely missions that knights will take on of their own accord, not seeking the blessing or permission of their lord, whereas quests are officially ordained missions issued at court and which are typically more dangerous and far-reaching. Naturally, quests promise more glory than a mere adventure. 5. Fin amor is not about sex. This is a very well documented and studied concept of romance from this period called fin amor, which is this highly ritualized form of courting and erotically charged, passionate friendship between two people. It shouldn't necessarily culminate in copulation, and actually, if it does, that is a turning point in the relationship and a potential fall from grace. This is an interesting place where women at court have a lot of power and influence over the men in a traditionally portrayed setting. 6. There are 3 ways to make a knight. I really appreciated the fact that the authors included 3 methods for creating a player knight. You can use a pre-generated character, of which the book provides 6, covering different sorts of archetypes like the courtier knight or the religious knight. Then you have a constructed knight, which uses a point buy system that is detailed in the book. And finally, you have randomized knights. These are noted as being favored by experienced players because they get to try and explain away bizarre trait and skill combinations through some sort of concocted backstory. I honestly can't see doing it any other way. The whole point of role-playing games for me is to create an interesting story, and this is the first place I'd go to in this game to do that. But it's nice to have the other options if you're in a hurry or something. 7. Your knight has 1 name. I thought this bit was interesting, rooted in history, obviously, about how everyone technically just has 1 name, a first name. There are no last names. However, you could have a by name, and there are 4 types of those. Patronymics and matronymics take on your parent's name. So for example, your knight could be Fitzgalen, which means son of Galen. Then there are locative bynames, which describe a person's place of origin. For example, Jasper of Londinium, or more likely in the French, Jasper de Londinium. Then there are characteristic bynames like Fiona the Fair or Morian the Stout, just anything that describes a physical feature or another. And finally, there are occupational and social bynames like Win the Farrier or Bella the Alewife. 8. Knights get 4 horses. As a matter of course, all knights above the station of mercenary are provided 4 different horses by their lord. They get a war horse, called a charger, 2 riding horses, called rounceys, 1 for themselves and 1 for their squire, and finally a pack horse, or sumpter. If they lose any of these horses for any reason, their lord will replace them. 9. Traits will guide you and steer the story. I unpacked this quite a bit in my video of the Pendragon Starter Set, so I won't go too into detail here, but basically every player knight has 20 pairs of traits, and each pair is rolled on for a variety of reasons. To make a check, to possibly provide a hint to the player, and in some cases even to dictate the nature of the reality of a situation. There are 4 possible roll results, and they sort of dictate how your knight will behave. This might be a little controversial to some, since it takes away a fair amount of autonomy from the player. It ends up not being the player who decides how a knight reacts, especially in more important and pivotal scenes, but rather the dice and the numbers on their character sheet. But this unpredictable quality is really at the heart of the fun of this game, and ends up generating a lot of hilarious, unexpected moments. 10. Passions are at the heart of being a knight. Passions are mechanically very similar to traits, but players can invoke them to get bonuses on rolls as well. Essentially, you're always keeping an eye on your list of passions. Some are universal, such as your knight's passion for homage and fealty, which are loyalties owed to your lord or other superiors, as well as love for family and devotion to your deity. But through the course of a story, you will adopt new passions. Sometimes you will have to roll on these passions, whether you want to or not, if they're invoked in a scene, and you risk melancholy or madness with a bad passion roll. It is entirely possible to temporarily lose control of your character due to bad passion rolls, at which point your duty as a player is to record this as part of the knight's personal history. It's all part of the game, telling the story of overly dramatic knights. 11. Remember your place, peasant. One of the universal passions listed on every player knight's sheet is station, and that refers to the rules of the class system. They are utterly fascinating. Offense to station, which could require a remedy by the knight, include when a commoner fails to lower their face when speaking to a noble, when a commoner takes liberties with a noble, like using sarcasm or making jests, or heaven forbid when a commoner threatens a noble with violence. But it swings both ways. As much as commoners must be subservient to nobles, it is up to knights to protect them against attack by foreigners and ruffians, and knights must never do violence to commoners that gives the impression of impropriety. 12. Peasantry is multifaceted. It's not just king, nobles and clergy, knights, and then peasants. Well, that is the general structure of society in feudal Britain, but the peasantry, or commoners as they're sometimes referred to here, are 95% of the population, and thusly it is a more nuanced picture than just everyone sitting in filth making mud pies. Most commoners are farmers. You have free yeomen, who are land-holding tenant farmers. Then you have village dwellers called villeins. Some of these villeins are tradesfolk like millers and blacksmiths. Then you have serfs who have relatively little freedom. They owe labor and a portion of each harvest to the lord who owns the land they live on. Then outside of the feudal system, you have burghers who live in cities and owe their allegiance to that city. Most burghers are artisans, shopkeepers, and merchants. Entertainers and soldiers who are not knights or squires are also commoners. Members of the nobility can degenerate into commoners if they lose their wealth or their land. They will usually either become a bandit or join the clergy. And very occasionally, there are commoners who rise into the ranks of nobility. This usually happens by marriage when a poor noble family needs the wealth of a rich commoner merchant. 13. Noble versus commoner instruments. Don't let your player knight make the mistake of learning the wrong kind of musical instrument if they have the time or inclination to learn any at all. The gittern, harp, and lute are totally fine for nobles to learn and play, but there are 13 verboten instruments reserved only for commoners. Honestly, the list of commoner instruments seems like a lot more fun. 14. Honor is hard to gain but easily lost. There is this floating score associated with every character in the game, and that's their honor score. Long story short, you can pick up honor here and there doing good deeds, and hopefully the GM is generous with them because there are so many more ways to lose honor. Obviously, you won't have your knight openly robbing people, stealing cattle and livestock, extorting money from local residents, assaulting various people, becoming accused of rape, attempt to murder a duke, break and enter an abbey and burgle it, or escape from prison multiple times. But maybe you will. It totally depends on those passions, right? 15. Glory is the point. This is a very interesting sentence in this rulebook, and one that should be in bold. The object of the game is obtaining glory. There are detractors of this core rulebook who say that it doesn't offer enough GM advice. I disagree. This sentence is the guiding light for both GMs and players. If you didn't watch my Pendragon Starter Set video, glory is this score attached to every character in the game, most importantly, your player knights, that acts as a singular measure of their fame and notoriety. You never lose glory in Pendragon, so even bad deeds can earn you glory, even as you lose honor. But here's the point. If you don't know what you're supposed to be doing in this game as the GM, take a step back, come up with an adventure or a quest for your players through which they can earn glory points, and then set them on that adventure or quest. And if they seem reticent about it or confused, turn to page 123 of the core rulebook and point to this sentence. Now, that being said, if you have a cooler idea or concept for a session or campaign, go with that. But this game's baseline objective could not be any clearer. Here's a great outline of the scale of glory points. Kill some bandits and get 25 glory, but kill a dragon and get up to 500 glory. 16. Chivalry is complicated. Chivalry is not touched on in the starter set, mostly because it's a fairly involved concept. Check out this list of behaviors that you need to keep in mind if you want to steer your knight towards a traditionally chivalric existence. According to the lore of the setting, there was no chivalric code before King Arthur. It was only with his coronation and rule did the concept of chivalry get introduced into the culture, and it brings with it the hope of progress and an upgrade to human existence in the realm. 17. Chivalry gives you superpowers. If your knight has the prerequisites in their traits or skills or other stats, then they can qualify to be one of 3 different kinds of ideal knights: a chivalrous, religious, or romantic knight, to be specific. So for example, if your knight has a total of 96 points in the traits of energetic, generous, just, merciful, modest, and valorous, then they are considered chivalrous knights and get, quote, supernatural armor worth 4 points of armor protection. All 3 ideals actually give you complete immunity from any supernatural effect that would cause them to directly violate a tenet of their underlying ideal. Check this out. In the case of the religious knight, Jesus gives you plus 4 hit points. If you're a pagan, you get plus 2 hit points and can heal faster. It's great and accurate too. 18. There are supernatural horses. In the appropriately lengthy chapter on horses, there is this sly mention of the fairy horse as one of the 14 types of horses or mounts that you might come across. I wish I could tell you more about this horse that needs no rest and can run on water, but this is all they give you on the matter. Well, actually, they stat this horse out in the combat horses table and note that these are for fairies only. I didn't find fairies mentioned almost anywhere else in the book, so you'll have to use your imagination on this, I guess. Okay, I actually have a sidebar here, definitely a complaint about this book. Where's the magical stuff? There are occasional references to fairies, goblins, magic, and giants, but they are only mentioned very briefly and in passing. Where's the delivery on this? There are no stat blocks for dragons or giants. There isn't even a paragraph on magic in the setting, although maybe I missed it. Look, I'm not looking to play Pendragon and expecting to throw fireballs and ride dragons, but if it's the case that this setting is supposed to contain an element of magical high fantasy, then I formally require at least a text block and maybe as much as several pages on the subject. That is all. 19. You or someone you care about will be ransomed. One of the more peculiar features of the world of Arthurian knights is the fact that enemy knights and other important persons in society are worth more alive than dead. So if you have the choice of either killing or capturing enemies on the battlefield, in most cases you want to just capture and then ransom them. I love this schedule of prices for people of different stations in society. I would like to point out several prices in particular. The nobles and higher up clergy appear to fetch, well, a king's ransom, I guess you could say. 300 or 600 libra is notated as what you might read as 300 or 600 British pounds, but keep in mind that a single librum is enough to support a commoner family for an entire year, and high-ranking knights only get a stipend of around 10 libra per annum, and even that stipend is almost entirely in goods and services and not cash. So with that in mind, 300 or 600 libra is a ground-shaking amount of money. Ransom is big business in this game. 20. No favor goes unpaid. A clever GM running this game is going to keep track of favors owed between characters. When a favor of any sort is done for a character, that character will typically owe money or an equivalent favor in return. It's a lot more transactional than it might be in the modern day, and there's actually a decent amount of guidance here for GMs to conceptualize this, although I have to say this might end up causing a lot of bookkeeping for a GM. 21. Players who miss a session still play. I don't think I've ever seen this in an RPG before, but Pendragon has a whole mini-game for players who miss a session. If you recall, the game essentially plays out 1 year of in-game time per session, and if a player misses a session, they could potentially miss out on a lot of story development. But with so-called solo scenarios, they can roll their way through a relatively quick simulation of an in-game year in order to stay at the same age and level of character development as the rest of the party. The solo scenarios are not an extensive game all their own, but rather a quick way to make sure that there are no knights left behind in a campaign. I would love to see this in more RPGs. It's just a detail that addresses the hard reality of this form of gaming, which is that it's challenging for people to always make it to every session, and yet the story will march on and leave them behind if they're not accounted for somehow in the fiction. 22. Old age is the end for your knight. There's this phase at the end of every session or so called the winter phase, and it's where you sort of step back and go through a number of procedures to simulate the passage of time, advancement of your character and their fortunes and their horses, all kinds of bookkeeping. It's really a core aspect of the game, but there was one funny detail that stood out to me in particular. So aging starts at age 35, at which point you have to make aging rolls every winter. These rolls can and often do result in the degradation of your core stats. Well, if your con stat hits 5 or lower, check this out. You're considered decrepit and, quote, may no longer participate in play. That's pretty final, but to add insult to injury, your character may no longer receive glory. Even more, you roll a d6, and if it's higher than your current con stat, you just die. You're dead. 23. There's guidance on how to convert older versions. I appreciate the fact that they included the guidance needed to convert stats from older versions of Pendragon into this version. The instructions run for one full page, and where you're going to find the most difference is in which skills are listed. Hey look, there's fairy again. It looks like fairy lore is from the older editions, and now it has been combined with folklore into folklore. This actually makes me wonder if the creators of this newer edition were actively trying to downplay any elements of high fantasy. 24. You can and will design a personal coat of arms. There are 7 glorious pages in this book explaining what a coat of arms is, what their significance is in the setting, what they're composed of, and most importantly, how you can create your own. I love this section, not because of how long it is, but actually of how short and concise the explanation and instructions are. There have been many books written about this subject, but I don't want to have to read 300 pages on coats of arms. My suggestion would be to read this section thoroughly, and then go to a free site like MyBlazon or comaker.com to quickly build your own personal coat of arms. Okay, so that's my list of favorite aspects of the Pendragon 6th edition core rulebook. Next, I want to briefly discuss some more Arthurian media you can use for inspiration. In my review of the Pendragon Starter Set, I mentioned a few Arthurian works in pop culture that could help the GM and players get into the right mindset. Since Arthurian fiction really peaked over half a century ago, you really have to seek out this kind of media. It isn't really in the zeitgeist these days. In my previous video, I mentioned the movies Excalibur, The Sword in the Stone, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, King Arthur, Legend of the Stone, and The Green Knight. And TV shows included Camelot and Merlin. And books that I mentioned included The Death of Arthur by Thomas Malory, a sort of foundational collection of stories published in 1485, as well as The Once and Future King by T.H. White, published in 1958. Well, after hearing from a lot of commenters on that video who know a lot more about Arthurian media than me, here are a few more books that can greatly inform and inspire your Pendragon campaign. I'll leave links down below for all this stuff. The Great Book of Arthur and His Knights of the Round Table by John Matthews, published in 2022. This book is written in contemporary language and contains both stories from Malory's The Death of Arthur, as well as a number of stories that Malory left out. This is pretty cool because a lot of folks treat Malory's collection as the definitive one for Arthurian lore, but Malory intentionally left out a ton of stories in order to cram as much as he could into 2 volumes while sitting in prison. So this book is a treasure if you're wanting to go deeper down the rabbit hole. The Pendragon Cycle by Stephen Lawhead. This is 6 historical novels published between 1987 and 1999. The first 3, Taliesin, Merlin, and Arthur, are a cohesive trilogy that was intended to be a 4-book series. I can't speak to how well the final 3 books tied up any of the loose ends, but at any rate, you're going to get a lot of quintessential Arthurian storytelling. The language is, again, quite a bit more contemporary than the Middle English of Malory's work, so it's very accessible. The Warlord Chronicles, aka the Warlord Trilogy by Bernard Cornwell, published between 1995 and 1997. This series is a mix of historical fiction and Arthurian legend, much like the Pendragon Cycle, and was actually adopted into a mini-series in 2023 called The Winter King, which ran for 10 episodes. Maybe most notably about Cornwell's treatment is that he depicts Merlin as a lecherous, mischievous, potential scam artist, where the quote-unquote magic that happens in the story could just be the result of coincidence, psychological manipulation, primitive technology, and illusion preying on people's superstitions and religious beliefs. And finally, The Bright Sword by Lev Grossman, published in 2024. This is a 600-page novel, just as a warning. It tells the tale of several minor knights in the Round Table who live well after the glory days of Arthur's reign and his named knights. These new knights include one who is gay, one who is trans, and one who is of color, which is not to say that those are the defining features of the stories, but it was definitely Grossman's intent to break out of the common mold of Arthurian tales. So that's it for the Pendragon 6th edition core rulebook. I'd love to hear your experiences with this game. Leave them down in the comments. Also, let me know if you've read any of the books I mentioned at the end there, or if there's any other Arthurian legend media that you've really enjoyed over the years. Links for everything are down below. Thanks for watching. See ya.